Chapter 7. I have seen this universe. When Ishin entered with a bundle of fresh roses, she gasped. The maiden was in the corner of the room, screaming, as blood jutted from the brachial artery in her arm. What of the other half of her arm? It lay on a bed whose lavish pillows and blankets were stained with blood. Elthrendil, cleaver in one hand, was attempting to calm the maiden. One blood-stained hand was reaching forward, attempting to soothe. It was not working. "I thought you said no surgery with axes," the maiden cried. "This is not an axe." "It does the same fucking thing," shrieked the maiden. Elthrendil frowned. "And people say my diction is confusing. An axe and a cleaver are completely separate instruments." "Bastard! Elthrendil!" Ishin said. "Ishin?" Elthrendil said, turning around. "Ishin!" the maiden said at first in excitement and then again in fear. "Maiden," he chopped off my arm. "Elthrendil?" "Best to do it now and quickly, like a beaver with a dam." "Elthrendil," Ishin said coldly. "I will show you a dam, Maiden." "Ishin," Elthrendil and Maiden said together. "Everybody calm down and be silent," Ishin yelled. Both Elthrendil and the maiden complied. With a wave of her hand, Ishin cleared the bed of all blood and viscera. The pillows fluffed themselves as the covers rolled back into place. All that was left was the maiden's hand still twitching on the bed. Ishin let out a deep sigh. The maiden watched as Ishin then made her way over, gently, yet firmly, pushing Elthrendil aside and presenting her with the bouquet of flowers. With a shaking arm, the maiden took the flowers. She smelled them, taking in their unnaturally pure fragrance. "Roses, my lady," Elthrendil said, turning toward Ishin. "They were the finest left in the garden," Ishin said over her shoulder. She then glanced back at the maiden. "I'm sorry their delivery was tarnished." "What is going on?" "We make haste to the steel," Elthrendil replied. "Huh?" the maiden said. "Where? Why?" "Time is ticking, my lady," Elthrendil said. "We must depart." "Elthrendil, you are not helping. Be less direct." What? Oh, like a male praying mantis, my greatest achievement yields my own slaughter." The man walked over to the door, giving the maiden and Ishin space. As soon as he was away, the maiden unleashed everything that had happened to her onto Ishin, from the time she woke up until now. At the end of everything, the maiden was gasping for breath. However, Ishin was smiling ear to ear. The maiden wasn't sure if the high god heard anything, despite her being well, to the maiden's knowledge, omniscient. "I've missed talking to you," Ishin said. This made the maiden's face grow warm. "But unfortunately, Elthrendil is right. We are keeping a tight schedule. We are going to try and save more ether eaters. If you agree, you'll be the bait to draw another into range of objects known as steel. It's how we saved you, and we're going to try again. But we have to go soon." "But the high god said no," the maiden replied. "Well, I am a high god," Ishin said, "and I'm saying yes. We cannot let the others know until after we're finished. If they see that you're near a steel, my siblings will investigate and ruin this attempt." "But aren't I the bait, Ishin?" "Yes, but it won't seem like you're near the steel. We're going to make them believe that you're still right here." Ishin's eyes fell on the maiden's severed arm. The maiden understood but frowned. "Did it have to be an arm?" "Well, it could have been a leg, I suppose." "Or most of your vital organs," Elthrendil chimed in. "My darling, we do not have long," Ishin said. "Allies are amassing to help make this possible as we speak. But at the end of the day, the choice must be yours. I cannot bring you into this danger without your—" "Ishin, I have to go," the maiden replied. Ishin nodded as if she already knew. Afterward, all three of them were gone in mere moments, as Ishin ferried them to the site of their great deception. The maiden leaned against the steel underneath a curtain of twinkling stars. There were so many that the valley in which she stood was as bright as midday. Her eyes trailed upward often to watch them and the perfect artifice of the steel. The steel rose above all things in the valley. It was warm to the touch, already surging with unfathomable power, twisting in impossible spirals. Its jagged obsidian-like surface reflected faint crimson glimmers that danced like trapped embers in its grooves. Intricate carvings etched into its towering form seemed alive, patterns flowing like liquid metal frozen mid-motion, defying logic. Each line was precise, deliberate, crafted by hands that understood the geometry of dimensions beyond the maiden's comprehension. Veins of pulsing light threaded through the structure, shifting with a rhythm too complex to be random. It loomed, not merely constructed, but forged with divine purpose. Underneath those stars, The double helix structure thrummed along with its two other brothers further on in the valley. According to Elthrendil, they were on the prime ring east of Yonano, wherever that was. The maiden had not paid much attention to the geography books Nicholas had lent her all those weeks, no years ago. That sent a pang of pain into the maiden's heart. Nicholas had been alone for all that time. A part of her wished that she had gone to him, but maybe that would have been worse. Nicholas would certainly not have liked to come here around all these people. The maiden couldn't see them, but she knew they were all there in the darkness. Hundreds, if not thousands of living beings were ready to give their lives for this plan. The soldiers of Rose Hollow were hidden among the valley's jagged rocks, their charcoal black armour absorbing the faintest glimmers of light. They knelt in perfect rows, their shields braced against the earth, their swords sheathed, but ready. Not a clink of metal, nor the rustle of fabric betrayed their presence. Even their breathing was a controlled rhythm, inaudible against the gentle whisper of the wind. It was as though the valley itself had swallowed them whole, transforming their disciplined ranks into the silence of stone. Villages of people could have walked between the sheer sides of the valley, never knowing Rose Hollow's finest lay in wait. Beneath the ridges and hidden caves, the dragons lay coiled, their immense forms cloaked by spells so potent that even their colossal breathing went unnoticed. Their scales, which shone like great lanterns in sunlight, were now dull as ash, blending seamlessly with the stone around them. They had allowed teams of soldiers to shower them with debris to create this effect. It was certainly an indignity, but a worthy one. Among them waited the great heroes, their silhouettes blurred by enchantments that made them seem more like legends than mortals. Their eyes glowed faintly with determination, their humming with magic and will that promised victory. Together, this army was not merely hidden, it was erased. They were an invisible storm that had gathered its might in a valley where the enemy would see nothing, until all their fury was let loose. Elthrendil had promised the maiden he had seen no finer force assembled. Yet the maiden did not know if they would be enough. She imagined the grim determination on their faces. 1,000 faces all waiting in the dark, perhaps waiting to die. The maiden did not like that at all. "Do you remember the plan?" The maiden turned, seeing Ishin approach from within the valley itself. She wore her armour, although the maiden was unsure if Ishin needed the armour, or if it was to quell the unease of the soldiers. "I'm the bait," the maiden said. "I don't move. I let Elthrendil and the others handle it as you use the steel." Ishin smiled and nodded. She brushed up against the maiden as she leaned on the steel with her. Ishin drew her hand behind her back as the maiden felt a spark of magic. When Ishin pulled her hand back, it clutched a pristine mithril shield. She presented the armour to the maiden, who gently took it. "For you. It's a gift," Ishin said. "From me." "It's so light," the maiden said as she slid it onto her arm. "Don't worry, it is still very strong," Ishin said. "As long as you're behind it, nothing should touch you." "Maybe," the maiden said, frowning. "Do you doubt my craftsmanship?" Ishin asked, perplexed. "No," the maiden said as she glanced out beyond the valley. There was a great forest that swayed in the breeze of the late night. The forest was alive with noise. It was a noise that filled the silence. Maybe a long time ago the maiden would have let that noise keep the silence at bay, but now was a time for hard words. "They ripped me apart, Ishin," the maiden began. "I felt all of you gazing at me. It was agony, worse than anything I have ever experienced before. Why would you let them do that to me?" For some time after she had spoken, there was silence. The maiden turned back toward Ishin and let out a small, shallow gasp. In the starlight, she saw a single tear slip down the goddess' perfect face. Slowly, Ishin turned to face the maiden. In the ocean blue of Ishin's eyes, the maiden saw true pain and knew she had not suffered along that day. "I swear I fought them with all I had." "I'm sorry, that question wasn't fair. They had to know who you were, Maiden. All of them would not relent until they knew. Now they do, and I swear I will never let them touch you again." Her voice had bite. The final words were like a hiss, then the pristine melodic voice that Ishin usually produced. It was so shocking that the maiden hadn't realized that she had reached out. She clasped Ishin's hand tightly, and the goddess did not pull away. "Why did they still say no?" the maiden asked. "High gods make mistakes. All of them made the same one?" the maiden asked. "Ishin, if I'm that broken, should we be here? I don't want Elthrendil or the soldiers or you to be killed if I'm—" "Let me tell you what you are," Ishin said, interrupting the maiden. She grabbed the maiden's other hand and pulled her close. The maiden stifled a yelp at the firmness of Ishin's pull. She was close enough now to feel the heat radiating off of Ishin as the maiden looked into her eyes. Sometimes there are things in this world that change us irrevocably, moments that alter us so earth-shakingly that we are never truly the same again. Sometimes it is death, loss, misfortune, luck, or so many other moments. I am supposed to be unchanging, Maiden. However, when I first saw you, when I first beheld your gorgeous face, it was— Ishin trailed off, and the Maiden realized she was looking at her. The piercing eyes of the goddess fell upon her, and it seemed like Ishin was gazing somewhere else. At that first sight, I was changed forever. When I saw you, I knew that everything would be different, but I didn't appreciate how different. At first, you were a part of my sphere of influence that was new, Ishin beyond what the universe had experienced before. You gave me a new experience, one so tremendously amazing that I never wanted you away from me. Then whenever you would show up with flowers and your smile that was another new, it was so new to me. I thought it impossible to be any more amazed by you. Yet with each passing day you showed more grace, more patience and more beauty than any other I have ever known. Whatever you're thinking about yourself, my darling, is wrong. I have endured these past 3 years, so do not tell me that I cannot spot how the world is different without you in it. More than any other high god, I have seen your whole mural and not some small piece in the corner. What you are is beautiful. Oh, Maiden, it doesn't matter what they see, because let them overlook you. I don't want to share. I have seen this universe and all it has to offer. However, I'd trade all of it if I could just be with you the rest of my endless days. The Maiden was speechless. Her mouth moved as she tried to form some words, but what resulted was some meaningless babble that was barely a whisper. All she could focus on was Ishin's eyes and hands. Are you okay? Ishin whispered. So completely fine, the Maiden said louder than she intended. It was loud enough that it caused Ishin to turn a different colour. The Maiden didn't know what that meant. She did know what the horns meant, though. From high above the valley, the scouts had seen one. An ether eater had arrived. Elthrendil knew the situation was fucked. He stood on a falling piece of rubble that had been launched high above the clouds. On the way up, he had caught his breath, patched a few injuries, and made a quick entry into his journal so he wouldn't forget the details later. On the way down, he partially reconsidered this move. However, he realized that the squirrel does not mourn in the spring if he's buried too many nuts. Preparedness at the price of labor is a worthy trade indeed. As the Fae rode his piece of rubble, he saw that perhaps they were all squirrels who did not plant enough nuts. The valley lay strewn with the partially obliterated bodies of dragons, soldiers, and angels. They had encountered all different kinds of sudden and brutal deaths at the hands of the creature that rampaged toward Ishin, whose id stood glowing at the center of all 3 steels. The beast took on a humanoid form beneath a cardinal red cloak. This cloak was not feathered. Instead, it seemed like stretched skin, like that of a naked mole rat. As he watched the cloak, it seemed to undulate with the face of those who had been consumed by the ether eater. Elthrendil knew the old wisdom to never trust those who openly mistreat their guests. To the Fae, this was the worst host he'd ever seen. As he fell, he watched this ether eater cleave a passing wyvern with its clawed hands. Each claw ranged between 5 and 40 feet long at any given time. Their shifting length had been the death of many on the battlefield. Many more had not avoided the cloud of waving golden tendrils that emerged from the ether eater's back. With a single touch, the string of golden light would devour anything it touched. Plant, rock, or flesh, the type did not matter. Even to whales who only prey on shrimp, all fish in the sea still knew that they could be food. Elthrendil knew all was food to a whale of this size. Not just fish, but the sharks, other whales, and the reefs of the sea. Elthrendil considered his position as he plummeted from his perch. This beast was indeed entropy. It was considered the weakest ether eater. This was good. However, the weapons of all those who fought the creature quickly decayed. Their armor was rusting before their very eyes. Keeping within range of her would prove difficult. But then, Elthrendil remembered the noble swordfish. Afterward, he was content that this whale could be beached. Before Elthrendil's rubble crushed entropy, he stepped off his rubble into ether itself. The art of ether stepping was one often lost on many. He heard it told that to ether step is to be like the fastest minnow. In a stream in a forest like any other, there was a minnow who was the fastest minnow. The other fish told stories of how the heron could never catch this fish. This minnow was so fast that the other minnows had never seen him swim at his fastest speed. Yet, one summer, a drought struck the forest. The stream dried up to a mere puddle. On a fateful day, a shadow moved across the waters of the stream as the great heron, hungry and desperate, loomed over the pond. All fish began racing around the pond except the fastest minnow, who found a spot and was perfectly still. The heron pounced on the other fish as it devoured each one whole. As it worked, the fastest minnow sat in a reflective beam of sun which hid it from the eyes of the heron. It did not move until the heron's leg brushed past the minnow in the puddle. The minnow moved slightly, almost imperceptibly, and clung to the leg of the heron. Soon the heron flew away with the minnow on its leg. The bird visited another pond which it had previously picked clean. As it left this second pond, the fastest minnow swam into the murky bottom of the pond and escaped. The minnow's speed lay in its knowing when to move, and not how quickly it could. Ether stepping was much the same way. Elthrendil allowed the world to move around him until he stood in front of the impact crater on the ground. The chunk of rubble, which he had ridden for so many minutes, lay charred and smoking at its centre. Elthrendil thanked the rubble before golden tendrils erupted out of the rock, and it was consumed forever. Now at the centre of the crater stood Entropy. Elthrendil noted that she had alabaster flesh, yellow eyes, and makeup the colour of her cloak. The Fae could see no hair, and therefore assumed that Entropy was bald. A garish golden crown sat fixed upon the Ether Eater's head, which made it impossible for Elthrendil to peek, even if he wanted to, which Elthrendil did not. Then her eyes focused on Elthrendil, and he gave her a bow. Perhaps she did not yet deserve such a courtesy, but Elthrendil would treat the whale with manners that befit a maiden. He smirked. "May I have this dance?" "Elthrendil," Entropy said as she climbed out of the crater. "I presume? Indeed, you've heard of me." "The mad dancer of Rose Hollow?" Entropy asked, her voice low and distorted like it was passing through electrified water. "Yes, I have heard of your cur." Elthrendil twirled his sabre as a smile crept across his face. "Be careful," he said, and then Ether stepped right beside Entropy's ear. "I may take offence, my lady." With a quick swipe, he opened a pristine wound across Entropy's face. The dance had begun. Following the teachings of the sailfish, Elthrendil darted back. The claws of Entropy followed. One touch and you are dead, little Mino, the Fae thought. It was a passing one only. He was a tornado of deflections and ripostes. He slid right then, horizontally flipped through the outstretched claws that carved into the cliff behind. Elthrendil landed. Golden tendrils lunged. The Fae rolled forward under them. Upon standing, more claws. He deflected with his sabre, then moved in. Elthrendil felt the tendrils dance perilously close to his face, before letting loose another strike on Entropy's throat. She howled and pressed him. Everything in her was in forward motion. Claws, tendrils, magic, and rage all forward. Elthrendil laughed as he danced amongst it all. This was more of a foxtrot. He was smooth with long flowing motions that arced past Entropy's onslaught. Along the way, the mad dancer would flick his wrist and sever the tendons in Entropy's arms. A moment of peace bought at a bargain. "Good job, Mino. Good job," he thought. Others tried to help him, but they did not understand speed. They died fast. That was good. Dying slow seemed miserable. "Stop laughing," Entropy said as she lunged for Elthrendil. He ether step onto her outstretched arm. Her eyes went wide as he kicked her in the face. Multiple times, the Fae laughed while he did it. Eventually, Elthrendil was forced to retreat off her forehead by the web of tendrils that the Ether Eater had woven, but by the time he was done, she was huffing like a boar. Elthrendil gave another bow to Entropy. "My apologies. You are simply a fantastic jester." She came forward again, this time her claws extending to different lengths. Parry, parry, mistake. Elthrendil slipped on the blood-drenched ground, momentarily losing his footing, and the claw drove through his right tricep. Bother. He sliced off the claw before backpedaling. His blood mixed with the ground. "I have killed high gods." "Not as many as your siblings," Elthrendil replied mid-dodge. "What, half a dozen?" "More," Entropy replied as she struck down a knight who had charged her. Elthrendil didn't know the man. His death was a stupid one. He had no chance. Yet Elthrendil thanked him for his sacrifice. "Not many more," Elthrendil said. "For a being like you, how shameful. How shameful is it to meet resistance here from our meagre lot? This is quite the army." "Nothing compared to a high god," Elthrendil said. He needed to keep her talking. "When the lions compare themselves to lizards, they should be surprised when they starve. Yes, they have done twice as well, but their stations are not equal. Killing Ishin will be all the satisfaction I need," Entropy hissed. She swung back an army, readying her attack, but Elthrendil was tired. He ether-stepped his sabre into her right elbow. "There are reasons why I am blade to high god's monster," Elthrendil thought. Without moving, he pulled his blade backward and ripped her arm from her body. Elthrendil hated killing. Removing limbs was more humane. Elthrendil surged forward. His outstretched fingers caught the arm. Good. He spun forward like a tornado. Using Entropy's own arm, he batted aside the tendrils. Ether eaters don't eat themselves. The golden tendrils bounced off the alabaster flesh as Elthrendil cleared a path to Entropy's body. He felt the cosmos with him. The music of the rings and all ether seemed to sing to him at that moment. Stars shone bright like spotlights as he took center stage. Elthrendil exhaled ether. It swarmed from his body to the edge of his saber. He heard the harmony of the universe wail as he drew back a slash that would rip out Entropy's heart. Not yet. Elthrendil realized that Ishin wasn't ready. If he broke Entropy's form now, their mission would be for nothing. He broke the harmony. Elthrendil cut off her other arm. The Fae quickly ether stepped away as the tendrils converged once again. When he dropped into stance once again, reassessing Entropy, he saw that she knew. Elthrendil couldn't land the killing blow. He had to hold back. Already Entropy's arms were regrowing themselves. In this test of attrition he had no hope. Now the Ether Eater's eyes turned to Ishin. She was glowing brightly now, as the steels began to roar. "Nice try, swordsman," Entropy said. She summoned a blade of her own made out of gold. It was a rough blade, jagged and lacking elegance, but it showed only the faintest signs of rust. That was impressive. Elthrendil glanced at his own auburn blade. "We'll end this here." Like a rabid dog, she was upon Elthrendil again. Swords, tendrils and claws all lashing out in wild gambits. Elthrendil punished every risk he could. The Fae took limbs, tore out bones and more, but it was pointless. Entropy did not fear the killing strike. This was why the natural world had death. Without it, the animals would make like starving vultures and tear all the flesh of the universe away. Here it is, Elthrendil thought. Vulture incarnate, I name you. Entropy who feasts on carrion and fears no death, you are that which death restrains. Your madness, your recklessness, only tempered by your desire to bring all low and work all the meat from every bone. What a foul thing you are. Elthrendil plunged his sabre past Entropy's non-existent defences and into her forehead. It was the Ether Eater's turn to laugh as she buried her claws into Elthrendil's side. The Fae screamed in agony. Ether stepped backward into the wall of the valley. Blood gushed from 10 horrid wounds. Elthrendil knew he could heal them, but there was no time. Entropy, that malformed inevitability at the end of life, strode forward. Elthrendil raised his rusted sword and saw that it had cracked in half from the impact against the valley wall. He had a dagger, but it would not reach Entropy's flesh before rusting away. "Any more cutting words?" Entropy asked. "You would not understand my wisdom," Elthrendil said with a smile. "Parables are beyond you, and I shall not peddle half-truths just so your mind can understand them." "Who cares?" Entropy asked as she raised her sword. The Maiden drove her shoulder into Entropy's side as she barreled into her. Both she and the Ether Eater went tumbling into a heap. Elthrendil tried to shout something to the Maiden, but she didn't hear it. She stumbled to her knees, raised her shield and began to drive it down into Entropy's face. The bones deformed as the Maiden kept bringing down the shield. Thick gouts of blood exploded from Entropy's nose and eyes, which each successive impact. She had seen too many die already today. Elthrendil would not be added to that list. Suddenly, the Maiden felt the golden tendrils wrap around her shield. Within moments, the mithril was turned to grey dust. As it faded away, all the Maiden could think about was what she was going to tell Ishin. Entropy's claws crashing through the Maiden's chest brought her back to reality. The Ether Eater punched a hole in the Maiden clean through. Lacking lungs, the Maiden choked on the air as Entropy laughed. The golden tendrils began to wrap around the Maiden too. They were warm to the touch, not painful but not pleasant, as the Maiden felt some sort of energy attempt to rip her apart. It wasn't strong though. The Maiden thought it was like a child pulling at their parent's hand. When she glanced back at Entropy, who still lay on the ground, their face was reconstituting into a shocked expression. The eyes rematerialized, widened, the lips curled into a grimace. While in Rose Hollow, the Maiden had grown used to seeing this look on the face of civilians, but she never thought she'd see this expression on an Ether Eater. "Ataxia," Entropy garbled out of a still broken jaw. The Maiden shook her head and reached out with her hands. She grabbed Entropy's shoulders, pushing her into the valley floor. The Maiden began to push so hard that the ground beneath the Ether Eater began to crack. Entropy struggled against the Maiden once more, but again it felt like a child. The Maiden held her foe down with ease. That was until the oxygen ran out. The ether eater continued ripping into the maiden with her free-clawed hand. Chunks of half-formed liver and lung tumbled out of the maiden like candy from a piñata. Spots began to form along her vision as she desperately started to gasp for air. The blood in her veins stagnated since she had no heart to pump it. Without warning, the maiden found herself lying on her side as Entropy struggled to her feet. "I will deal with you later, sister," Entropy said over her shoulder. Through the spots and the haze that overtaken her mind, the maiden saw Entropy moving towards Ishin. The High God's eyes were closed, all their attention dedicated to activating the steel. Entropy's golden strings of light flared outward like a 100-limbed squid descending on its prey. The maiden tried to scream, but she had no air. With one hand, she started to crawl forward, pulling on every ounce of strength she had left in her weak body. This weak body, the maiden thought. Is this what the High Gods feared? Me? I cannot even breathe. Elthrendil can strike me down whenever he wants. In that moment, the maiden realized she was tired of this weakness. The hopelessness that she felt was repugnant. If she was a scary monster, then at least all of this suffering was understandable. But for her to have nothing, for her own body to fail her at this test, to fail in front of a being that was lesser than her, was unacceptable. The maiden felt rage. She hungered for relief. Some power within her heard this anger. It had long been suppressed, but now answered the call to fulfill its purpose. The maiden was hungry. All of a sudden, she felt warm. The hole in her chest began to fill itself as the maiden became consumed in golden light. Her legs were strong again, so she stood. Once more her eyes focused on Entropy, who had turned around. The maiden looked to her side, seeing an aura of golden tendrils consuming the ground around her. Everything they touched, the maiden consumed. Rocks, weapons, and the corpses of the dead all became fuel for her. A taste crept into the maiden's mouth. It made her hum with glee as she felt it roll across her taste buds. It was rich and complex, a perfectly harmonious flavor that seemed impossible. Sweetness bloomed first, warm and golden, followed by a whisper of spice that danced on the edges of her tongue. There was a depth to it, an umami so profound it sent shivers down her spine, awakening something primal within her. Every part of the world she consumed melted, its essence transferred to her mouth, where afterward it left a lingering aftertaste that demanded more. Her fingers trembled as she consumed more, her mind drowning in the sheer ecstasy of it. It wasn't just delicious. No, this was different. It was maddening, a flavor that consumed her as much as she consumed it, leaving her desperate to chase it again. The more the maiden consumed, the more strongly she felt the flavor. She did not realize that she was carving a path toward Entropy. That was until out of the corner of her eye she saw Ishin. In that moment, the maiden cried out. Entropy was too slow to avoid the outstretched hand that caught her. The maiden drug her to the ground amongst the mud and blood, as the taste threatened to overwhelm her. "Let go, sister!" Entropy screamed as she futilely kicked at the maiden. It was equivalent to a fly biting an elephant. Yet in that moment, the maiden was also powerless. All she could do was hold on and eat. The area around the two sank as the maiden dug a hole with her tendrils. Her excavation did not slow, did not halt, and maybe couldn't. What was left of her reasonable mind knew that she was keeping Entropy away from Ishin, and that's what mattered. "Stop this!" Entropy screeched as the light of the steels whirled to new heights. The maiden felt incredible power bearing down on Entropy. She held on tighter. It was all she could do. The maiden felt the world explode. All the Ishin fired the steels into Entropy. The maiden awoke in a crater. She was missing the lower half of her body. It lay a few paces away. She looked to her side. Within arm's reach of her was a beautiful woman, almost as beautiful as Ishin, but not quite. A mop of black hair surrounded her. The maiden and her could have been sisters. "Wait, we are." The maiden reached out with a hand to try and grab the woman. However, her hand faltered. She was weak and hungry, so very hungry. Then Elthrendil was there, holding one arm to his bleeding side, trying to stanch her frankly absurd amount of bleeding. He was panicked. The maiden smiled. He did care. "Maiden." That was Ishin. She slid into the maiden's view. Her eyes still shone brighter than every star in the sky. Ishin was saying something, but the maiden couldn't understand it. The darkness called to her. The maiden closed her eyes and fell asleep.